Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Good evening and welcome to the Union League of Philadelphia. For our guests tonight, we are so glad that you are here, whether you are a member or a member of the public. My name is Jason Rea. I am the Chief Learning Officer of Founding Forward. We are the nonprofit organization of the Union League focused on civic education, with a special emphasis on students and teachers, as well as the general public. We do immersive and transformative programming, not just here in the League House, but out in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where we have a 75-acre campus. This week, there are a group of high school seniors from Sacramento, California, who are spending the week with us, learning about what Philadelphia and Valley Forge means to American history and what it means to be civically responsible. And we are thrilled to have them here. Everything that Founding Forward does, from programs like this to programs like that one with the students out at Valley Forge, are funded by individual donors, and many of them are here tonight. So let me say thank you to all of you who have been supporting Founding Forward and the work that we do. For those of you who have yet to support us, my friends Laura and Kristen and Peter are here, and they would be happy to talk to you afterwards about what you can do in support of civic education and Founding Forward. Tonight's program is a collaborative with the Royal Oak Foundation. We are thrilled to have them back here in the League House. And in just a minute, I'm going to introduce their representative, who will introduce our speaker. But first, we are going to have Q&A at the end of tonight's program. We are going to do it by microphone, which means you all have to be on your best behavior. It means no speeches. It means you have to end your statement with a question mark. That's what makes it a question. And we're going to ask you to do it as quickly as possible so that we can get as many questions in as possible, because we have such a great crowd here. At this point, let me introduce Kayla Smith from the Royal Oak Foundation, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Kayla Smith, and I am the Assistant Program Director at Royal Oak Foundation. I want to start by thanking you all for joining us tonight. It is always such a treat to be down in Philadelphia, coming from New York, so I love being here, and thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you, Founding Forward and Union League, and the wonderful, very helpful programming staff that's been so lovely to work with, for hosting us here tonight. For those of you who may not know, Royal Oak is the American membership affiliate of the National Trust in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Our lectures seek to raise awareness and advance the important work of the National Trust. But we also try to highlight the best and most recent scholarship of all things British, including history and biography. Before we begin, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Mark Pickett, who is the primary underwriter for the Royal Oak programs. Also, thank you to the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation, who provided additional support this season. Our appreciation also goes out to loyal Royal Oak members, whose names appear on the screen, who have donated to support Royal Oak lectures and programs. Their generosity literally makes these lectures, both in person and digital, possible. So thank you. Now, without further ado, tonight I am delighted and thrilled to introduce best-selling author and journalist Sonia Purnell. Sonia is well-known for her lively writing and meticulous research, and she has a huge global readership and fan, including myself. Her first book, Just Boris, A Tale of Blonde Ambition, a biography of Boris Johnson, was long listed for the Orwell Prize in 2011 and remains his definitive biography. Her second book, Clementine, in the US title, unveiled the crucial role of Winston Churchill's wife, Clementine, and influenced her portrayal in media such as Netflix's The Crown. Sonia's last book, A Woman of No Importance, described the incredible story of World War II spy Virginia Hall, and the book won the 2020 Plutarch Prize for Best Biography. However, tonight, we are here to listen to Sonia Purnell speak about another amazing and trailblazing woman. The subject of her latest book, Kingmaker, Pamela Harriman's astonishing life of power, seduction, and intrigue. Sonia's research re-examines the life of Pamela Harriman and reveals now new details about Harriman's influence on 20th century politics. Her book already has received rave reviews and accolades from the Financial Times, New York Times, Daily Mail, CNN, and public radio. I'm thankful Sonia has taken time out of her busy and exhaustive schedule here in the US to come back and talk for us this evening. I know you all join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Sonia Purnell.
Well, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay at the back? Okay, all right, that sounds good. It's a great pleasure to be back in Philly, one of my favorite places, and I am really grateful to everyone who's made this possible. This is my third book about very interesting women. I don't really see them as feminist histories. I see them really as trying to set the record straight on what really happened. Clementine, as Kayla was just saying, was Winston Churchill's wife, and it did incredible things. And Churchill himself said that he couldn't have done anything in his life without her, that she made his work and his life possible. And yet she'd often been missed out altogether in 800-page biographies of Winston Churchill, quite extraordinary. So I tried to set that, on the right path. And then Virginia Hall really was very much ignored again, but an extraordinary secret agent working with the French resistance during the Second World War, described as by the Gestapo as the most dangerous agent of all. And they sent out orders in 1942 that she must be found and eliminated. A lot of people simply couldn't believe that there was a woman doing all this incredible work, and particularly a woman with a wooden leg that she called Cuthbert. Pamela Harriman is a very different character, obviously, from either of those two women, although she was extremely close to Clementine. And that was really how I got to know Pamela, was writing about Clementine and wondering how on earth is it possible that Winston and Clementine Churchill so relied on a woman who was 20, 21, 22 at a time of, incredible conflict and danger, that they relied on her to perform a geopolitical role of quite extraordinary type. And so I wanted to find out more. I was always going to come back to her. So just for now, I'd like you to look at this photograph and look at her eyes. So she's about 26 or 27 at this point. And I think there's something quite interesting about, I have a 27-year-old son, and he has seen nothing like she had seen by this point. I hope. In more ways than one. But those eyes, there's a certain power in them. I also think there's a certain sadness in them. This is in 1947, so it's roughly 46, 47, roughly 2 years after the end of the war. An awful lot has been written about Pamela Harriman, not all of it flattering. So I just want, as you look at her face and those eyes, I just want you to think about two questions that seem to come up all the time about her. So one is, the first one, sorry, it's the only time I'm going to look down here because I want to get this right. So was this alluring, flame-haired Englishwoman, descendant of the legendary 19th century courtesan Jane Digby, you might have heard of her, was she just a money-crazed, sex-obsessive, intent on acquiring vast wealth by stealing other women's husbands? Some of you, okay. But I'm going to ask you to reserve judgment until you've read the book. Because the other question is, or was she a self-doubting woman born into a male-controlled world, but driven by deep curiosity and an absolute yearning to be in the room when the big decisions were being made and to make her mark on a tumultuous century? Was she, in fact, a power player who's never really been given her due, but used everything she had, oh yeah, I understand this, everything she had for war and peace? Or in fact, was she a little bit of both, or did one lead to the other? I really would like you to try and not make up your minds until you've read the book, because I think you will find an awful lot surprising in that book that might well, if you have one opinion now, change it. But let's see. Okay. So how did she end up, this woman? How did she end up an American? And, you know, I was looking at the inscription here everywhere. Forgive me if my Latin pronunciation is terrible, but Amor Patre Ducit. She certainly loved this country. She really loved this country. And she believed that in its sacred role of leadership. But she was born this little girl in well, actually not in Dorset, but she grew up in Dorset. She was born nearby, rather sweet little girl, quite precocious. Rumor has it, or family folklore has it, that she learned to speak from a loquacious cockatoo. She certainly had quite fixed ideas early on, and she was going to go out for an outing with her mother one day in their first car, and they couldn't open the gate. And so Pamela, not much older than this, stamped her small foot in fury and said, "Man will come and man will fix." Well, sure enough, a few moments later, a police officer arrived, alerted by the kerfuffle, and indeed opened the gate. And indeed, man did come and man did fix. And this was something that Pamela learnt at this very early age. But she realized that men had the power, and actually men had a lot of the fun, and they also had the education, which she so desperately wanted, but was not allowed to have. So home, his mum and dad, Lord and Lady Digby. Home was a 50-room mansion in Minturn in the rolling hills of Dorset, really quite remote. You can't see any other lights at night, even now. Back then, it was even more remote, of course. So in those 50 rooms, not one of them was a bathroom, because her grandfather, who had built the house from an old one, which had bad drains and rats and goodness knows what, had decided that bathrooms were disgusting. Okay, well, a bit of an eccentric maybe. So there were many other rooms for many other purposes, but not bathrooms. Have a look at her face, by the way. I think that's the face of a rather sort of stroppy teenager. I recognize it from my own children when they were of a similar age. She is thinking about excitement and thrills and going away from this, you know, remote place. I mean, her parents wanted to live there. By the way, the house where the house is was the inspiration for Thomas Hardy's book, The Woodlanders. But she wanted to get away from all that. The family crest has an ostrich, which suggested the excitement of faraway lands. Her father, Lord Digby, in those days, peers could vote in the House of Lords, and he did. And he was a staunch conservative with a big C, the Tory party. But he absolutely forbade any discussion of politics at home. He had fought in the First World War and nearly died. He didn't want to think about these things. He simply wanted to have a quiet life in the country. So politics was not to be mentioned. And the other thing that wasn't to be mentioned was that legendary ancestor, Jane Digby, who had bedded one king and then bedded his son, who was another king, and then some brigands and then a Bedouin prince and a few others besides. And had quite a rip-roaring life. And she's written this intimate diary. But Pamela's parents, realizing that their eldest daughter was rather inquisitive soul, thought she might find it, so they burnt it. So we've never, unfortunately, seen the intimate diary. But Pamela knew of its existence, and she also knew, here she is, Jane Digby, she also knew about this portrait, which was hung out of view on the back staircase so that people coming to visit wouldn't be scandalized by this naughty woman. But Pamela wasn't scandalized, she was excited. So what she wanted to do was go away to faraway lands that might have ostriches, talk about politics, get involved, and perhaps be a little bit like Aunt Jane. It didn't quite work out that way. So though she was the eldest of 4 children, the third child was a son, Eddie, which meant that he inherited everything. So he got the house, the money, but most important, as far as Pamela was concerned, he got the education. He was sent away to Eton. She begged and she begged and she begged to be sent away to school. Her parents said no, because young ladies back then, particularly the daughters of peers, were not to be educated because that would make them unsuitable wives and not very attractive ones. So the only time she was ever sent away after desperate pleading was to a school where she learnt domestic science, meaning sewing and cooking, 2 things that Pamela never had any intention of doing. whatsoever. In fact, Pamela got her first proper education when she was 17. She was sent to Munich, of all places. This is 1937. You might think a strange place to send your daughter. It was obviously the headquarters of the Nazi party. But it was thought that the Bavarian culture was disciplined and polished, and it might make her a real attractive person in the forthcoming marriage market known as the season. Well, it wasn't a very attractive place to be. It was a brutal education. She saw people goose-stepping in the streets and, raised arm salutes to Hitler. She heard his speeches on the radio, rapid speeches. Her mother, quite unusual for English upper classes in those days, had Jewish blood from several generations back. She was completely horrified, but also baffled because she had this curiosity always. And so she said to Eunice Mitford, who she knew a little bit from back home, "I'd like to meet the Führer." And they met in the Englischer Garden very briefly. But she came away perplexed by how this unprepossessing man could exert such power over an entire nation. Just extraordinary. And this excited her interest in politics even more, and how power can be used for evil as well as good. So her brain was racing about this, but sure, she had to come back and make polite conversation, not mention Hitler or the Nazis or Czechoslovakia or the Rhineland or anything, because the season was coming up. And she had 12 weeks to hook her husband. And her parents were really hoping that that was a duke, because you see, they were running out of money. They had 36 servants. That was expensive. And they were losing cash a lot because the land taxes had been very fierce after the First World War to pay for what had happened. And so they really wanted their daughter to marry up, and a duke would be splendid. And hence all this kind of finishing her off so that she would have accomplishments. But I'm afraid to say her season did not go well. She wanted to talk about politics. Well, young women weren't supposed to do that. She was also a little round for fashions of the day. Some of those dresses had waists of 17 inches. Pamela's waist was not 17 inches. But most of all, she was just too inquisitive and curious. This wasn't how women were supposed to be. And so she was reduced to, hiding in the powder room sometimes because no one was asking her to dance. Even Kit Kennedy, seen here between two of her brothers, who was in town because obviously her father Joe was ambassador to the court of St. James's, dismissed Pamela to JFK, Jack, as a fat, stupid little butterball. That wasn't the worst insult. There were a lot, more cruel than that. But interestingly, Kit would become Pamela's best friend ever, because as Kit began to get to know her, she realized that she was not fat. Well, she might have been in those days, but that wasn't the point. She was not stupid. She knew a lot, and she was curious and everything. And Kit had been brought up at the Kennedy dinner table to discuss politics. And here was another young woman who was just as inquisitive, just as, intellectually driven, wanted to know about the world. And so over time, they became very good friends, but not quite yet. So at the end of that season, disaster, Pamela's on her own. War is now declared. Britain declares war on Germany. She still doesn't have a husband. She has failed. All the young men are going to go away to war any minute. And then a phone call comes in from the only son of Winston Churchill. Now, Lord and Lady Digby detest the Churchills. Oh, they're rackety political people in London. Well, that's not the sort of people we want our daughter to mix with. But this was Randolph Churchill. And he said, would you come out to dinner? Well, Pamela didn't have another offer that night, so she said yes. They went to Quaglino's in St. James. It still exists, by the way, if you want to go and see. There's a big staircase that goes down, and he sat there. But he talked to everyone else most of the evening until coffee, when he finally turned around, looked at her intently in the most romantic way, or rather unromantic way possible, said to her, you look healthy enough to bear my child. Will you marry me? Or not my child, actually, my son. He wanted a son because obviously he couldn't countenance being a daughter to carry on the male Churchill line. Amazingly, Pamela said yes. He'd asked 8 other women that week already, and they'd all said no, because he had a reputation. He was a bit of a brute. He was a drunkard. He didn't pay his bills. He was insulting to waiters or pretty much anyone. He could have moments of charm, sure, but he lacked none of his father's warmth and humanity, really. He was quite a cruel man, but well, she had a few wobbles, but a few weeks later, they were married. Here they are. So it was quite clear that it was her duty to provide a son and heir, which she did during a huge air raid, by the way, at the prime ministerial residence of Chequers in the countryside. Absolutely terrifying. The bombs were one thing. The other thing was it a girl? Because she knew that wouldn't go down well. So the only thing she could say to the one nurse in attendance, everyone else having taken shelter, is it a boy? Is it a boy? And the nurse said, you've asked me a dozen times already. Yes, I am quite sure it is a boy. So there we are, there she is, heavily pregnant at Chequers. And if you look at her eyes again, they are fearful, because those bombing raids, and Pamela lived through most of the Blitz in London. So when people say she had no idea what bombing was like, that's absolutely not true. She didn't desert her post, except at this one minute when she was about to give birth. But anyway, the bombers followed her there. Chequers was quite a big target. So this was just before she gave birth. She was only 20 at this point. After she gave birth, oh, by the way, while she was in labor, where was Randolph? In bed with another woman. I mean, that was kind of, what happened. She'd pleaded with him to come to her, and he didn't. Anyway, Churchill rather adored Pamela almost straight away. She laughed at his jokes, she cut his cigar, she pulled out his brandy, but most of all, she understood what he was going through. He's now Prime Minister. Britain's plight is unimaginable now. We were holding on by our fingernails. Invasion was expected at any minute. Millions might die or be subjugated. There was only one way forward, one way that Britain could survive. And Churchill saw this very clearly. And that was enlisting American support. The new world coming to the aid of the old world. The problem was that American public opinion was against it. A Congress was against it, and Roosevelt was a politician to his fingertips and knew that nothing was possible without opinion shifting. This is way before Pearl Harbor, of course, but already the Blitz has started. Already Britain is running out of men, money, and military hardware. It couldn't have been more desperate. Pamela's living in Downing Street with Churchill by this point. Randolph is all over the place, he's not really around. Churchill has very much gone off his son. He still loves him, but he doesn't like him anymore. He behaves so obnoxiously, including to Pamela, but he loves this young woman being around, and he starts to confide in her all the pressures of war, all the matters that need to be thought about and discussed, all the terrible decisions, and the absolute necessity, urgency of enlisting American support. So, phase one of Pamela's involvement in that. So here's a young woman who thinks, I must save my country. I must save my friends. I must save my family. I must save everything. What can I do? The first thing is these pictures were taken by Cecil Beaton, and they're very endearing, but there was an ulterior motive. They were going to be sold to Life magazine, where a picture very similar to this was put on the front page. This was all thought out, and it was all about winning hearts and minds. Look at this winsome, vulnerable looking young mother with her young child. And indeed, it caused quite a stir, and people said, oh gosh, because at this point, obviously the whole colonial history still overhung relations between Britain and America. A lot of Americans were of German or Italian descent, didn't want to get involved in yet another European spat. So all of this had to be sold very carefully as, here are some Brits and they're just like you and they are worth saving, really. That was stage one. Stage two was altogether different. This involved, whenever important, influential Americans came over, that they must be enlisted to the British cause. The first one was Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's right-hand man. everyone noticed, well, he noticed that Pamela was the apple of the Churchill's eye. Within a few days, everyone else noticed that Pamela was the apple of Harry Hopkins's eye. He really thought, what an absolutely amazing young woman, and told one Aly Harriman, who was about to come over, she is more plugged in than anyone else in Britain apart from Churchill himself. You must get to know her. Well, Aly Harriman did, and quite well. But first of all, Pamela had to be equipped for this special role, and that involves wearing a special uniform. And this is the special uniform. And in case there are any fashionistas amongst you, this is a Norman Hartnell chocolate satin coloured frock with bejeweled clasps. And I think you might agree she looks pretty good. This isn't the dress she was wearing the first night she met Aly Harriman. We don't have a picture of that, but they were all supplied for Pamela to do her special operation. That night, it was a gold lame shoulderless dress, and she looked absolutely sensational. And there was a dinner party at the Dorchester Hotel where the newly arrived Aly Harriman was invited, and he was in charge of the military aid program called Lend-Lease. So his opinion was even more important because he could perhaps supply food, medicines, planes, ammunition, whatever it was. So there they were at dinner. Everyone expected Pamela to sit next to him because the seating plan had been organised beforehand, and of course she did. And then she started on what people came to know as her mating dance. And just to give you a little example of how this started, strokey of Avril's forearm. She'd done her homework on Avril. He was rich, very good looking, but had great insecurities. He's had a really unhappy childhood with a disciplinarian father. Some people thought him dull. Sometimes he'd make a joke, but no one would laugh. And so Pamela laughed at every single attempt at repartee and fixed her beautiful sapphire eyes on his. And this was all going terribly well. And then there was a raid, a huge air raid, Avril's first. They turned off the lights, pulled back the blackout curtains, and could see all these enemy planes coming towards them, dozens of them. And they saw Selfridge's department store catch fire, and Avril said, let's go downstairs to my suite, obviously lower floors, safer, so we can talk easier. Anyway, afterwards, Avril said, there's nothing like the Blitz to get something going. And Pamela said it was a very fortuitous raid. And in short, it was, because thereafter, that hard-headed businessman type, the rather aloof, rather cold, was completely smitten, not only by Pamela, but the whole cause of saving Britain. By the time he came back to DC a few months later, people said, have you been bewitched? You're so pro-Brit. But he did, from then on, he did everything he could to save Britain. And, you know, Churchill and his entourage were incredibly grateful and realized that they had enlisted someone to their cause that was going to be really helpful. Here he is, actually after the war. But you can see that, you know, he was a good-looking man. Pamela, by the way, in case you're thinking this is a very dark idea here, she was totally willing. She saw this as her patriotic duty. She really did. And who knows what's happening in maybe Ukraine now, or what you might do, actually, if your homes, your family, your friends, your country was in that kind of peril. None of us know what we might do. She knew, because she was, you know, at Churchill's side, how desperate things were. So she was prepared to do it. And soon she became effectively an intelligence broker between them. So she would take what the British line was to Avril and then take back any thinking that she heard of that was going on in Washington, military priorities, as, you know, after Pearl Harbor. And she became this kind of incredible high-level intelligence broker. We're talking at the age of 21. Don't know what you were like when you were 21, but I know I wouldn't have been capable of that. And it wasn't just Harriman, soon it was others. So it was Fred Anderson, who was in charge of bombing leading up to D-Day. That was very difficult because the Brits and the Americans had very different ideas about strategies, and her job was to try and smooth things out between both sides, because she was also sleeping with the head of the RAF. So this was very, very useful. But Ed Murrow, I don't need to introduce him to you, I'm sure. Bill Paley, the head of CBS, Jock Whitney, who had very useful intelligence contacts, and several others. She had a strategic sex life. She had a network of useful lovers, to the point that professors of diplomacy today call what she was doing politically significant. And that, in fact, this is when the special relationship didn't exist. I mean, this was one of the ways in which that special relationship was created. So it was never just about military alliances, although obviously those were key. It was also something more emotional. And she perhaps didn't love all those men, but she certainly liked all of those men. She never went to bed with someone that she didn't have, you know, a fondness for. So you're wondering, I expect, what about the little boy? Well, here he is. Now, Churchill used to say that he, or rather his private secretary used to say about Churchill that he dearly loved his family, but his purposes always came first. I think that's the same with Pamela. I think she was influenced by Churchill in many ways. And the little boy, though she loved him, was second to what she was doing for her country in the Anglo-American alliance. And although little Winston lived with her quite often in her apartment in Grosvenor Square, then known as Little America because it was near the American embassy, almost entirely inhabited by Americans, she was about the only Brit. And little Winston would often be there, although he would be taken out of London when the Blitz got really bad. But he spent so much time in the company of these men who would come, and she would get them around her table and extract information and soothe their fears and things, that when Lord Beaverbrook came round one evening, he was slightly shocked, because little Winston was about this age at the time, because I went up to Lord Beaverbrook and said, "Will you have a cocktail with me?" So he'd learned early on. So here's Ed Murrow, looking rather dashing. See how he looks like Avril? I mean, Pamela definitely had a type, that sort of dark-haired, high-headed, sort of very manly look. She didn't like blonde, pretty boys. He's standing in front of the BBC there. I'm sure you know about his broadcast, This Is London. Very powerful broadcast, often credited with weaning America off isolationism and very much directing America to privilege the war in Europe over the one in Pacific, even after Pearl Harbor. Well, she was often sitting next to him while he made those broadcasts and would feed him selected tidbits of information, which she and Churchill hoped would persuade him to, you know, again, say that Britain had to be saved. So she had a pretty exciting war. She was right at the center of everything. She knew everything. She was trusted by Churchill. On the night of the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, just for example, the first major operation by Allied troops in Europe since, you know, the Nazis had taken over, Churchill was terrified. He thought it might be like Gallipoli. He was absolutely beside himself. He had pushed for that against American opinion, so it was all down to him if it went wrong. Who does he call? As he always calls in these circumstances, it's Pamela. And what they do is they play bezique while they go through again and again the preparations, the arguments in favor of it, all the early reports as they came in. This is what she did, and he did rely on her completely. So at the end of the war, as you all know, Churchill won the war with Roosevelt, obviously, but lost the election. He was thrown out. So her source of power finished too. Her marriage was over. That probably doesn't surprise you. She didn't have much money. By the way, Randolph never forgave his parents for this and had huge rows with his father for the rest of Churchill's life. He eventually found out what she had been doing and how it had been at Churchill's behest, and that she was, you know, very much working with him. So the marriage was over. but she couldn't talk about what she was doing. It was way too sensitive. No one would give her a job. She had no qualifications. She didn't have much money either. And yet she had tasted power. What was she going to do? Well, the only thing that was open to a woman in those days, and we're talking about the 1940s when society is contracting again for women, is to, and this is a quote, attach to a powerful man with an interesting life, because this might be an entry into something for herself. So here she's wearing incredible clothes. She became effectively, lovely French word, a grande horizontale in Europe, and had many rich and powerful men, including a Rothschild, including Aly Khan, but most importantly, Gianni Agnelli. And this was the one that really appealed to her. This is the real love of her life. Here he is on the left. He was strikingly good looking. That's one thing. But also, he was a project, because of course he was heir to the Fiat Car Corporation. They had got rich on supplying tanks and trucks to Mussolini and Hitler during the war. He'd been on the wrong side of history. Churchill used to refer to him as that awful Italian car mechanic who couldn't understand why Pamela was running around Europe with him. But Pamela saw a project. She knew Churchill, and she eventually got Churchill to have dinner with Agnelli. I'm not sure anyone else could have persuaded him to do that, but she still had incredible influence over Churchill. But perhaps even more importantly, she introduced him to people in DC, because what was possibly about to happen was that the Allies would take Fiat away from the Agnellis altogether. And Agnelli obviously didn't want that to happen. He was also worried about what would happen to Italy if it did. So she started using her contacts in DC, including the CIA when that was set up, and also tutored Agnelli how to operate on the world stage. So although he was a businessman, he was eventually described by people like Kissinger as a world statesman. She tutored him with everything she had learnt in Downing Street during the war at Churchill's side. Agnelli was so grateful because, yes, he did get to keep Fiat. And yes, the CIA helped him, actually, because they saw it as a bulwark against communism, which was quite a strong force in Italy at the time. So how did Agnelli say thank you? He bought her the biggest possible jewels, so big that some earrings that he gave her, if she turned her head, they would swing round, sock her on her skin and leave a black mark. I mean, that's how big they were, just extraordinary. Anyway, they stayed together for 4 years, but in the end, even though she converted to Catholicism, this was never going to work because he was an Italian man of the 1950s, and Pamela got fed up with starlets popping out of every wardrobe, as she put it. At one point, she found him in flagrante with a friend on her terrace. I think that was the final straw. So she left him, but what she said always was that they split up, but they never parted. Agnelli tired of everyone. He'd always had everything all his life. But the only person he never tired of was Pamela. And from that day on, he called her every single day until she died at 7 a.m. Eventually, he married Marella, who you see here, who was an Italian princess who was more likely to put up with the starlets and the wardrobes and things, although she found it pretty difficult. Look at her neck, said to be the longest in Europe. And of course, she was one of Truman Capote's swans of Fifth Avenue, and as was Pamela, but she never quite had the riches that Marella was able to enjoy. So after Agnelli, she's actually really quite sad because this was her purpose. She had helped Agnelli rehabilitate himself, but what was she going to do now? So she became a grande horizontale again. Here she is in a mask. If she turned up at your party and you had a rich husband or boyfriend, you started to tremble because, you know, she was so good at being a seductress and doing her mating dance that, I've spoken to quite a few women who remember this very clearly. But in the end, she opted for Leland Haywood, who you might know of as having brought The Sound of Music to us all. He was an American because she had always wanted to go to America, and not just because American houses had lots of bathrooms, which of course she knew about, but because she had got to love America and Americans during the war, and it was something she had always wanted to do. She had met Leland once before. She'd forgotten because she was with Agnelli at the time. He'd never forgotten. And do you know why? They were on a yacht and Pamela came up on deck in absolutely nothing except those diamonds. It's not something you forget. Anyway, so she met Leland, who was married to Slim Keith at the time, but she was running off with Ernest Hemingway around Europe. And anyway, eventually they got divorced and Pamela and Leland got married. He was a slightly strange man. He would only eat white food. So chicken, vanilla ice cream, and white pasta. His career was tanking. Pamela again saw a project, thought that she might be able to help by coming up with plots and looking at box office takings, all that kind of thing. It didn't really work. Here is Leland, by the way, also looks a bit like Avril and Ed Murrow, but I'm afraid to say that he sought comfort in wild turkey, bourbon, and started becoming really quite ill. And she nursed him completely. But what she didn't realize is that she'd brought all the money she'd made as effectively as a courtesan. So she'd sold the apartment Agnelli had given her in Paris. She had a bit of cash. She invested everything in that marriage. She tried in every way to keep Leland happy. Leland, by the way, absolutely loved the idea that she'd had all these illustrious lovers before him. And he thought it was absolutely great. But he didn't stop drinking. He became more and more unwell, and his productions became worse and worse, until Mr. President, which was probably the worst of all, really a big flop, went to DC, and Pamela was panicking at this point, and she phoned up her old friend, who she remained quite close to, and said, please, please, could you come and support it? And there he is. You can see the playbill in the background. This is cunning, Pamela, though, because he said, because, you know, guess what? He had a few things to do because it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he was a bit busy. And he said to Pam, I'll come, but I can only come for one half, first or second. And she said, oh, no, come for the second half, because if you come for the first half and leave in the interval, that will look way worse. Smart thinking, huh? She always looked at things. And so he came, he did what he could. And there were lots of letters and little notes from him in her private papers. They were really quite close. So that's interesting, because he wasn't normally close to women except in that way, as we know. But still, she was nowhere near politics. So what she tried to do was take any chance she got. Here is David Frost, who did that program. Some of you may remember that was The Week That Was. And here she is trying to interest him in some political ideas of hers, anything she could do to try and get back to power. But Leland really didn't want her to. Extraordinary hat, by the way, don't you think? Quite sort of weird. Anyway, she went on nursing Leland, but I'm afraid he died in 1971. And then, very fortunately for her, she went to a party at Kay Graham's house in Georgetown. And guess who else was in the garden at the party? Someone who had refused to see her all these years, because he thought that she, you know, if it was known what she'd got up to and he'd got up to, it might affect his political career. But now his wife was dead, Marie was dead, and they met in Kay Graham's garden. And within a few months, they were married. She took American citizenship because she thought, now finally, here is my door into American politics. She loved him. He certainly loved her. In fact, he told her, I should have married you the first time. And many of his friends thought he might have gone further in politics had he done so, because he tried twice to run for president, but he never had that kind of common touch, as they called it then. He was a bit wooden, a bit aloof. People couldn't really relate to him. So it never really happened. But after they got married, she wasted no time. Here she is at a Democratic National Convention. She was soon meeting all the leaders of the party. Ed Murrow had really introduced her to democratic politics. And she was pretty bipartisan, by the way. She had plenty of Republican friends as well as Democrats, but she certainly wanted to attach her flag to the Democrat mast, which of course was Avril's as well. And so quite quickly, she really became a power in the Democrat Party. She was able to use her Churchill knowledge again. Here she is with Carter. She liked Carter as a man, but never thought he was right to be as a president. he wasn't the sort of communicator. She'd obviously seen Churchill communicate, and what a communicator he was, right? But Carter didn't have that. And so although she fundraised for him and supported him to some extent, she was never a big fan. She also started supporting some women into politics, although she always said, I'm not a feminist, I will only support women if they're as good, if not better, than the men. And here is Bella Abzug. Some of you might recognize her. She was supporting her in her run for the Senate, which didn't work out. After Avril died, she picked up a lot of what she'd always believed in, and it really took a lead in this, and that was trying to reopen communications with Moscow. This is now the peak of the Cold War, 1983. We came that close to nuclear conflict at least twice that year by accident. The Soviets were as worried, if not more worried, than we in the West were about nuclear conflict. So not long before Avril died, she and he traveled to Moscow to see Yuri Andropov, the new leader, Soviet leader. No one knew much about him. He turned out, by the way, to be the boss of one Putin, but he was also the sort of mentor of Gorbachev. So she went to see Andropov with Avril, who could barely see or hear at this point. So she did the talking, and she was able, after that meeting, which, by the way, only happened in the end because Andropov had heard all the Second World War stories about Pamela and said, I want to meet her. And so they got, considerable length of time with him, and she came back to Washington and was able to say, really the first time this message came back, the Soviets are now finally open to talking. There may well be some concessions here. And as we know, that eventually led to some arms reductions treaty. And Gorbachev came to D.C. in 1987. Everyone wanted to meet the Gorbachevs. Nancy Reagan invited Reza Gorbachev to the White House. Reza was not keen at all. They'd met once and not got on. Reza asked instead, could she go to Pamela's house in Georgetown? This didn't go down well in the White House, as you can imagine, but here they are. So Reza came round to her house and they had a lovely sort of discussion in Pamela's dining room with several other women that Pamela had invited to this meeting, which was, an absolute historic first, by the way. This stuff didn't happen. And at the end of the meeting, Reza Gorbachev, even though she was very progressive for a Soviet leader's wife, wasn't used to being in public, was nervous about coming outside because there were hundreds of journalists in the street. And so Pamela grabbed her hand and they walked out together to the press, hand in hand. And that's what's going on here. In 1980, there was the Reagan landslide. I'm sure you remember that. The Democrats thought it was all over for them, that they were never going to get back. But underneath this Van Gogh here, White Roses, now in the National Gallery in DC, then a Harriman possession, Pamela started gathering groups to try and look at policies that might win back, but particularly candidates. And she met a young man who everyone was writing off. He had a patchy electoral record, a messy private life. He didn't know anyone in Washington. All seemed to be a bit sort of over for him. But Pamela saw something in him, saw through all of that, thought that here is an exceptional communicator. And whether you like him or not, whether you like the fact he became president or not, it is extraordinary that she was really the first to see that here was a young man who could make it to the White House. And when I spoke to him, he said to me, oh yeah, I wouldn't have made it without her. And I wouldn't have been ready to be president before America and before the world without her either. Who was it? Yeah. Look at that photo. I find it really interesting. Look at that power dynamic. I mean, she would tell him when he'd done stupid stuff in a way that others often wouldn't. And they would talk late into the night. He would ask her about, Churchill and Stalin and all these other things in history, but everything that she had learned subsequently. And there are various letters in her private papers between them, which are really quite extraordinary. No, they didn't have an affair, if you're thinking that. but they were very close because they had the same superpower. Everyone who knew them both said this. So when Clinton talked to you for 15 seconds or 15 minutes, he would often make you feel, even if you started off the day thinking, I don't like Clinton, he made you feel like I was the only person in that room for those 15 seconds or whatever. She also had that power. She had, she really had an effect on people. When they walked into the room together, apparently it was like a supernova. They would often walk around arm in arm, and people said that there was, the charisma was off the scale. And so indeed, it came to pass that he became president. He won the election in 1992, and she was desperately hoping that he would recognize her in some way. For a while, it didn't seem like it was going to happen. And then finally, although he said it was the easiest decision he'd ever made, he made her American ambassador to France. Where? This is President Chirac, by the way, who became president of France in 1995. She went out there in 93. So originally it was Mitterrand, then Chirac, and she had helped him behind the scenes in his election. She probably shouldn't have done, but she got him some coaching for his TV debates. He was very grateful, as you can see here. But it wasn't just that, although that was a big thing. This was the time of Bosnia. Cast your mind back again. Genocide had come back to European soil. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands, were being killed by the Serbs. Again and again, the Allies, the West, had tried to solve this. Nothing seemed to work. She knew, as she always knew, that it would take American leadership for anything to happen. So she became really a lobbyist for intervention. And she also became an interlocutor between Chirac and Clinton, who were pretty much on the same page, but Clinton was hesitating about getting involved. Richard Holbrooke then comes in onto the scene, a very long-standing associate and friend of Pamela's. And together, eventually, as I'm sure you know, a peace process was worked out after a huge, the biggest at the time, NATO bombardment and intervention in Bosnia called Operation Deliberate Force. Christian Amanpour, who was a war correspondent at the time, said that what Pamela did was provide the moral compass for these world leaders, because she was able to say, I know what it's like to be bombed. I know what it's like to fear you're about to lose everything. We have to do something. And although America can't do it on its own, it has to provide the leadership. That was her argument. That's how she saw it. You might see it as a 20th century view, but think about why she thought that. America had saved the world in the Second World War, and she thought only America could save things again. So this is why Chirac is kissing her hand, because Chirac is very much involved with Clinton. They start to get on very well. And she dies in post in Paris. Actually, rather a lonely figure. Her stepchildren are suing her for money. She's semi-estranged from Winston, who she has helped all the way through, but never really quite got that relationship to the place that it should have been. So she was lonely. She was being sued. She was possibly about to be made bankrupt. She was working on the Bosnia war. She was on her own. Clinton once said, can you cope on your own with all of this? And she said, what's my choice? And indeed, what was her choice? She went swimming in the pool at the Ritz in February 1997, which she would do. That was her one kind of breakout activity. After 20 lengths, she collapsed in the water. One of the hotel staff pulled her out of the water, tried to revive her, but she's unconscious. The phone is going all over the place. Clinton is on one phone. Chirac is on the other phone. This guy's never had to deal with this kind of, all these presidents keep phoning up. And it was thought that he'd done such a good job that day with a very, very demanding situation that 6-7 months later, he was given the task of driving Princess Diana. And you all know what happened then. But the reason that he was given that job, even though we think he'd been in the bar that evening, was because he had coped with this kind of pressure. So Pamela's life support systems were turned off 2 days later. A lot of the obits were scathing. One commentator said she was expert only in rich men's ceilings. And yet the people around her thought differently. The people in the embassy thought differently. And when she died, President Chirac, a very aloof figure, very unusual this, went to the American ambassadorial residence where her coffin was before it was going to be flown back to America. And he made a very emotional speech, which his staff, who I managed to interview, told me he'd written himself. And in that speech, he described her as a peerless diplomat, a perfect interlocutor, and mentioned her in the same breath as Jefferson and Lincoln, and said that the world had been a safer place because of her. So, not just Richmond ceilings, huh? She was flown back to America, where she was landed with those full honors, as you can see. And there was an incredible funeral at the National the National Cathedral in DC. Everyone was there, including Clinton, of course, who gave the eulogy wearing a tie that she had given him on his most recent trip to Paris. And I remember him talking about her saying, that she had been present at so many world events, that how she had believed in America so fervently, her adopted country, but that also that he was in the White House in, quotes, no small measure because of hers. At that point, he said it publicly and wanted to make it quite clear of her contribution, and said that she had been a big part of the Bosnia peace process and that she had helped shape it. So when I hear that, actually, she was just that husband chasing, money crazed, sex obsessive who didn't really do anything, I beg to differ, because behind the doors, in secret, without shouting about it, she did a lot. I've only touched on the surface. There was a row with the CIA that she helped diffuse. Oh, and incidentally, when she died, a lot of the paintings had already been sold because she'd been running out of money. But there was one painting that really caught my eye. And it was of an ostrich, a beautiful painting of an ostrich. And I looked more closely at the small print, and it said, "A present in thanks from Nelson Mandela." And I was wondering about this. And then I found in her papers transcripts of phone calls and a meeting. And what I didn't realize is that before those first multiracial elections in South Africa, the ANC, Mandela thought he was going to lose because they didn't have the infrastructure. They didn't know how to raise money. They didn't have any money. They had no idea how to run an election. Who do you ask? Who's good at winning policies and winning candidates? Pamela. So he called her up in Georgetown, said, "I'm coming over for the inauguration. Can we meet?" And they did. And she set him up with various advisors, set it all up for him. And when he became president, he sent her that painting, knowing that her family crest had an ostrich in it. So here's one of the last photos taken of her, looking rather regal, by Annie Leibovitz. It cost us a fortune to buy this photograph, but I'm really glad we did, because it's sort of rather magnificent. And I hope when I'm in my mid-70s, I look anything like this. And I hope to waltz around in a black velvet cloak, just like Pamela was, because that's it. That ambassadorship was her first ever formal job, and she was 73, and she still had no formal qualifications for it. But so it's quite amazing. So as I said, she's one of 3 women who I've now written about, who all did way more than anyone realizes. There's Virginia Hall's cover, A Woman of No Importance, obviously ironic, but that's where the way she was treated both before and after the war. And Clementine, Winston Churchill's wife, who did so much to help us all live the lives that we do today. So thank you very much indeed for listening.